Scott Peterson, convicted of murdering his pregnant wife Laci and their unborn child Connor, now speaks out from behind bars. What happened?
Why should anyone want to hear your side of the story?
Because I didn't kill my family.
What makes a person capable of erasing their entire family? Not in a moment of rage, not during a heated argument, but methodically, deliberately, while smiling at neighbors and planning a future with someone else. What psychological wiring allows a human being to stand in front of cameras, pleading for help finding a missing pregnant wife, while already knowing exactly where she is? And here's the question that cuts deepest. Can someone commit an act so calculated, so complete, that they genuinely stop feeling anything about it within days? Most true crime coverage asks what happened or who's responsible. Those are easy questions. Evidence answers them. Juries answer them. But there's a question that's gone unanswered for over 2 decades, through countless interviews, courtroom proceedings, appeals, and even a 2024 documentary where the world finally heard directly from the man at the center of it all. That question is why. Not why in some vague philosophical sense, but why specifically, psychologically, and devastatingly. This case has an answer, a documented, forensically supported, behaviorally consistent answer that explains not just what Scott Peterson did on December 24, 2002, but why he became capable of doing it months before that morning ever arrived. And that answer has been hiding in plain sight, overlooked because people keep focusing on the affair, the lies, the boat, when the real story is about something far more chilling. It's about a man whose entire identity was a performance, and what happens when that performance can no longer be sustained. If you're here for surface-level coverage, this isn't it. What we build on True Crime VIC goes deeper, stays longer, and answers questions other channels don't even know to ask. If that's what you need, do me a favor right now and hit that like button and subscribe, because there's much more coming, and you won't want to miss what the evidence actually reveals when you follow it all the way down. 23 years ago, on Christmas Eve morning in Modesto, California, a 27-year-old woman who was 8 months pregnant disappeared from her home. Her name was Laci Peterson. Her husband, Scott, reported her missing that evening. 4 months later, her body and the body of her unborn son, Connor, washed ashore in San Francisco Bay, 90 miles from her home, in the exact location where Scott had told police he'd gone fishing alone that day. Scott Peterson was arrested, tried, convicted of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for Connor, and sentenced to death. That sentence was later reduced to life, without parole. He has maintained his innocence from the moment Laci vanished until today. In August 2024, he sat for his first on-to-camera interview in over 20 years. The world watched, hoping for answers. He offered none. He admitted the affair. He called himself a failure for cheating. He pointed to a burglary across the street as an overlooked lead. But he never explained why his wife and son were found where he said he was standing that morning. He never named who he believes is actually responsible. He never provided a factually complete alternative explanation. Here's what that tells us. After 21 years to prepare, with cameras, an audience, and a platform, a genuinely innocent man uses that moment to deliver names, specifics, evidence, and a coherent narrative that accounts for every piece of evidence against him. Scott Peterson had all of that, and still couldn't do it. Not because he's inarticulate or unintelligent, he's neither, but because the answer to why he can't explain what happened is the same answer to why it happened in the first place. To understand what Scott Peterson did, you have to understand who Scott Peterson actually was, not the version his defense team constructed. Not the grieving husband the media showed in late 2002, the version documented by people who knew him across years and across contexts. And what that record shows is a man whose entire sense of self was built from the outside in. From early in his life, Scott understood that his value came from how others perceived him. He was socially confident in a way that made people immediately comfortable. He was pleasant, agreeable, the kind of person who improved a room just by being in it. His college girlfriend later described their relationship as something that looked warm and complete from the outside, but felt strangely hollow when you were actually inside it. Colleagues who worked alongside him in agricultural sales remembered someone consistently agreeable and somehow impossible to truly know. His neighbors liked him. His in-laws adored him, until evidence made that impossible. Everyone liked Scott, but here's the critical detail forensic psychologists identified when they reviewed his behavioral history: that likability wasn't a personality trait. It was a survival system. Scott Peterson didn't have a stable core identity that existed independent of how people saw him. His sense of worth, his understanding of who he was, his entire experience of himself was constructed externally. He didn't just care what people thought. What people thought was the only thing anchoring his sense of existing at all. And this matters more than almost any other fact in this case, because a man with that specific psychological architecture doesn't process difficulty, failure, or conflict the way most people do. He doesn't move toward resolution. He manages perception. He conceals problems. He constructs narratives that preserve the image at all costs. And he does this so automatically for so long that the gap between what he presents and what he actually feels stops being a conscious lie. It becomes simply how he exists in the world. Scott Peterson wasn't performing for television cameras in December 2002. He'd been performing every single day of his life. The cameras were just the largest stage he'd ever stood on. This psychological foundation is the first reason this case unfolded the way it did. Because a man whose identity is entirely externally constructed cannot afford exposure. He cannot afford to be seen failing. He cannot absorb the specific public kind of visibility that divorce, financial collapse, and the dissolution of a marriage would create, especially in a community where his wife and her family were genuinely known and genuinely loved. For a man like Scott, exposure wasn't embarrassing. It was existential. Now let's talk about what was actually happening in Scott Peterson's life in the fall of 2002. Most coverage of this case identifies Amber Frey, the woman Scott was having an affair with, as the motive. She's not the motive. She's a symptom of a much deeper set of pressures. And understanding that distinction is everything. Scott met Amber Frey in November 2002 through a mutual friend. Amber was a massage therapist, a single mother, by all accounts someone who engaged with people in good faith. When she asked Scott the natural questions anyone asks when getting to know someone new, Scott told her he'd never been married. He told her he'd lost someone. He told her he was grieving, starting over, that he was a widower beginning again. Laci Peterson was alive. She was at home in Modesto. She was 8 months pregnant with their son. She was preparing for Christmas, making tamales with her family, fully present in a marriage she believed was real. Scott told Amber Frey he was a widower before Laci was gone. Take a moment with that. This isn't a story about infidelity. This isn't about a man who fell for someone else and got in over his head. This is a documented psychological record. It tells you with precision where Scott Peterson's mind was in November 2002. He had already mentally constructed the world that existed after Laci. He was already living inside that fiction. He had already introduced himself into a new life using a false identity built around a loss that hadn't yet occurred. Forensic psychologists who study intimate partner homicide have identified this specific pattern. The construction of a replacement life, complete with a false identity centered on the spouse being already gone, is one of the most reliable documented indicators of premeditated intent. Not the affair itself, the architecture of the affair, how it was built, what it required the person to have already decided. A man conducting a secret relationship doesn't tell his new partner his wife is dead. A man who has already decided what he's going to do does. Scott hadn't consulted a divorce attorney. He hadn't disclosed the truth about his life to Amber. He hadn't made any of the practical moves someone makes when planning to leave a marriage. He'd already chosen a different path. And the reason Amber Frey became so central to the investigation and trial wasn't the affair itself. It was what the timeline revealed about when Scott Peterson had already made up his mind. He wasn't a man who fell into an impossible situation and made a terrible impulsive choice under pressure. He was a man who had already built the replacement life inside his head, already introduced himself into it with a constructed identity, and was already, in November 2002, mentally living in a world where Laci no longer existed. What happened on the 24th of December wasn't the beginning of that world. It was the completion of it. Now, let's add the second pressure, money, and the image that money was responsible for holding up. Scott worked in agricultural product sales. It was a respectable position with a reasonable salary, but it wasn't a wealthy man's income. The life he and Laci maintained required careful financial management. The house, the vehicles, the golf, the social presentation of comfortable middle-class success. By 2002, that management was failing. Investigators with documented access to the family's financial records established that Scott was carrying financial pressure he hadn't disclosed to Laci. He was behind on obligations. Expenses weren't aligning with the income he was reporting. And then add the pregnancy. Connor was due in February 2003. A new child means sustained new costs. It also meant Laci stepping back from her work, managing a restaurant. The income she contributed would disappear exactly when new expenses arrived. More money going out, less money coming in. A situation already under strain becoming dramatically harder to manage. For most people, financial difficulty is serious and painful, but you restructure. You have hard conversations. You make difficult changes. You find a way through. But for a man whose entire sense of self is constructed from the image he presents to the world, financial collapse isn't just a practical problem. It's a public unmasking. The house disappears. The vehicles go. The lifestyle that signals everything Scott needed people to believe about who he was falls apart in public. And not just anywhere. In Modesto, where Laci's mother Sharon Rocha and stepfather Ron Gransky were known and respected, in a town where Laci herself was genuinely liked and genuinely valued. A divorce, alongside financial collapse, wouldn't have positioned Scott as the sympathetic figure. He would have emerged as the man who failed Laci Peterson, in a place where everyone knew exactly who Laci Peterson was. For a man whose psychological survival depends entirely on the image he maintains, that specific outcome, public failure, public exposure, the permanent dissolution of everything he'd built, may have felt unbearable in a way that's genuinely difficult for a psychologically grounded person to comprehend. Not because he was evil in some theatrical sense, but because for someone whose entire sense of self is externally constructed, the destruction of the image is the destruction of the self. He wasn't afraid of losing a marriage. He was afraid of losing the only version of himself he'd ever learned to be. And so the calculation assembled across weeks and months resolved into a solution that appeared to preserve everything at once. The life insurance, the clean beginning, the widower narrative he'd already rehearsed with Amber Frey. He'd already told her the story. He simply needed to make it true. But there's a third pressure. It's the hardest to state directly, and it's the one the evidence most thoroughly supports. The pregnancy itself. Laci was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant when she disappeared. Connor was due in February 2003, 6 weeks away. The nursery had been prepared. The name had been chosen. Laci had been anticipating her son's arrival with the full, open joy of a woman who genuinely wanted this for a long time. People close to the investigation, including those with documented knowledge of conversations Scott had in the weeks leading up to Christmas, described a man who had grown increasingly detached from the approaching reality of fatherhood. Not hostile toward it, detached from it, as though it was something happening in a life he was already watching from a distance. Here's the psychological mechanism that makes the pregnancy the most consequential factor of all. A marriage can theoretically be dissolved. Finances can theoretically be restructured over time. But a living child, a child born in February 2003, is a permanent legal, financial, and relational obligation that follows a man for the rest of his life, regardless of what he decides about the marriage. Custody arrangements, ongoing legal contact with Laci, ongoing presence in the life of her family. A thread, permanent and unbreakable, connecting Scott Peterson to the existence he'd decided he no longer wanted. The pregnancy wasn't incidental to the timing of what happened. The prosecution argued, and the jury found the argument persuasive enough to convict, that the pregnancy was central to why the timeline was what it was. Scott Peterson was charged with second-degree murder of Connor, specifically. The law recognized what the evidence showed. This was never a plan about removing a wife from a marriage. It was a plan about removing an entire life. A wife, an unborn child, and every obligation, every exposure, and every permanent connection that life represented. He couldn't have the fresh start he'd constructed in his mind with a living child who would need a father and a mother and a legal framework that bound Scott Peterson to Modesto and to Laci's family for decades. That's the reason no honest analysis of this case should omit. The affair, the finances, and the pregnancy weren't three separate problems. They were three converging pressures bearing down simultaneously on a man psychologically incapable of tolerating exposure, constructed around an image he couldn't afford to lose, and searching for the solution that removed everything at once. On the morning of December 2002, Laci Peterson was in a good mood. She'd called family. She'd texted friends. She was planning to walk the family dog, MC Kenzie, through the neighborhood park, as she often did. She intended to bake gingerbread cookies later in the day. She was 8 months pregnant, healthy, and had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. Scott left the house that morning and drove 90 miles north to the Berkeley Marina on San Francisco Bay. He told police, and would later tell the world, that he'd gone on a solo fishing trip. Out on the bay, in a 14-foot aluminum boat he'd purchased only weeks earlier, fishing for sturgeon, alone, on Christmas Eve. He caught nothing. No witnesses placed him at the marina during the hours he claimed to be there. He produced no launch ramp receipt. He wasn't an experienced open-water boater by any documented standard. When Scott returned to Modesto that evening, Mac Kenzie was found wandering the neighborhood with his leash still attached. Scott called neighbors. He called Sharon Rocha. He called 911. If you ever listen to that call, don't focus on what he says. Focus on how he says it, the cadence, the register, the specific emotional texture of a man reporting his pregnant wife missing on Christmas Eve. It doesn't carry the sound of a world that has just collapsed. 4 months later, in April 2003, Laci's remains were recovered at Point Isabel Regional Shoreline along San Francisco Bay. Connor's remains were found nearby days later, not in Modesto, not near any location connected to their daily life, not anywhere that could be explained by the alternative theories the defense would later attempt to construct. They were found in San Francisco Bay, precisely where Scott Peterson had told police he was standing on the morning his wife disappeared. The water brought her back, and it brought her back to exactly the place he said he was. Scott Peterson didn't become the primary suspect because investigators arrived with a preformed theory. He became the primary suspect because from the very first contact, trained detectives recognized he was presenting wrong. His composure was managed in a way that trained eyes distinguish from genuine shock. His questions were the wrong questions. Or more precisely, The critical and urgent questions that any man in his stated situation would be asking were entirely absent from his behavior. He didn't press investigators with urgency. He didn't ask with desperation where they were searching, what they needed, who they believed might be responsible. He performed a version of a worried husband, and the people trained to observe that performance saw through it almost immediately. He was cooperative, he was pleasant, and he was strangely unurgent about finding his wife. From the very first hours of the investigation, that specific combination, the cooperation without desperation, the pleasantness without fracture, the complete absence of the raw, unmanageable panic that overtakes a person whose pregnant wife has vanished on Christmas Eve, that was what trained investigators kept returning to. Not because grief looks the same on every person. It doesn't. But because what Scott Peterson displayed wasn't a variation of grief. It was the managed performance of someone running a careful internal script while the people around him ran a missing person investigation. Then there was the boat, a 14-foot aluminum vessel purchased just weeks before Christmas. He'd told almost no one about it. He'd used it perhaps twice. He wasn't an experienced open-water boater by any documented measure. And yet on the morning his pregnant wife disappeared, he'd driven 90 miles north to launch that boat alone into San Francisco Bay on Christmas Eve to fish for sturgeon, a species that requires specific knowledge, specific equipment, and specific conditions that investigators later scrutinized carefully. He caught nothing. No witnesses placed him at the Berkeley Marina during the critical hours. No launch ramp receipt was produced. The boat wasn't a detail. The boat was a map. And then came the phone call that changed the entire direction of the investigation. In late December 2002, a woman named Amber Frey contacted the Modesto Police Department. She'd seen Scott Peterson's face on television, the grieving husband, the man organizing search volunteers, the man pleading publicly for his missing pregnant wife to come home. She recognized him as the man she'd been dating since November. The man who had told her, in the early weeks of their relationship, that he was a widower, just beginning to rebuild his life after loss. Investigators asked her to maintain contact with Scott and to record their conversations going forward. She agreed without hesitation and without conditions because she understood precisely what she was being asked to help establish. Over the weeks that followed, those recordings captured something prosecutors would later describe as among the most significant evidence produced by the entire investigation, not because of what Scott said about Laci, but because of what he said about everything else. On calls recorded while Scott was simultaneously appearing on television as a devastated husband, while search volunteers were being organized, while candlelight vigils were held across Modesto, Scott Peterson talked to Amber Frey about Paris, about their future, about the life they were going to build together. He spoke with the warmth and forward momentum of a man whose problems were already behind him, rather than actively unfolding in real time. Those recordings didn't just contradict his public image. They revealed the emotional reality of a man who, by late December 2002, had already emotionally exited a life that included Laci. He wasn't suppressing grief in those calls. He wasn't forcing himself through them with effort. He sounded like a man for whom the relevant chapter had already been closed and filed away. But the evidence is only beginning to build. What happened next in the courtroom? How the defense tried to construct an alternative narrative, what the jury heard that the public didn't, and why Scott Peterson's own words, both then and now, continue to be the most damning evidence against him. That's all coming in part 2. If this is the kind of research and storytelling you need, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime VIC. Hit that like button so this reaches more people who want answers, not just headlines. And the question of why is about to get a full, documented, undeniable answer. Stay close. What happens inside the mind of someone who can stand at a vigil organized to find his missing pregnant wife, while simultaneously on the phone with his girlfriend planning their future together? What kind of psychological architecture allows a person to hear prayers being spoken for someone they've already killed and feel nothing. And here's the question that should terrify anyone paying attention. If the people closest to him, the ones who shared meals and holidays and years of daily life, never saw what he actually was, how would you? These aren't rhetorical questions. They have answers. Documented, researched, forensically established answers that explain not just what Scott Peterson did, but how a human being arrives at that capability without ever appearing dangerous to anyone around them. Most coverage of this case stops at the conviction. Guilty verdict. Case closed. Move on. But the conviction is where the real analysis should begin, because understanding how the system responded to what Scott Peterson did tells you everything about what the evidence actually showed when you assembled all of it in one place and forced it to speak. And what it showed was a pattern so clear, so consistent, and so psychologically specific that 23 years later, it remains one of the most complete documented studies of a particular kind of killer. Not the kind that announces itself through violence or rage. The kind that performs normalcy so completely that even trained investigators had to watch him for weeks before the mask started slipping. That's what Part 2 is about. Not just what happened after Laci disappeared, but what the courtroom revealed, what the appeals confirmed, what the 2024 documentary exposed, and why this case will matter long after Scott Peterson's name stops making headlines. If you watched Part 1, you already know this isn't surface coverage. What we do here on True Crime VIC is take cases everyone thinks they understand and show you the layers underneath that change everything. If that's why you're here, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed, because what's coming in this part will reframe everything you thought you knew about how dangerous people hide in plain sight. The recordings Amber Frey made at the request of Modesto police didn't just document conversations. They captured something investigators described as a window directly into Scott Peterson's interior state during the exact weeks the rest of the world believed he was a devastated husband, searching desperately for answers. On one of those recorded calls, Amber could hear voices in the background. A crowd gathered, the murmur of a community assembled to pray. Scott was standing outside a candlelight vigil organized for Laci's safe return, and he was speaking to Amber softly, warmly, about what was coming next for them, not nervously. Not with the fracture you'd expect from someone barely holding themselves together under unbearable pressure. He sounded like a man whose problems had already resolved and who was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. No physical evidence, no financial record, no forensic finding produced by the entire investigation created a clearer window into who Scott Peterson actually was than that single documented reality. A man at a vigil for his missing pregnant wife, on the phone with another woman, discussing their future, while people behind him prayed for Laci to come home. That's not the behavior of someone torn apart by guilt or fear. That's the behavior of someone who had already emotionally closed the chapter and moved on. In April 2003, hours after the remains recovered from San Francisco Bay were formally identified as Laci and Connor Peterson, Scott was arrested in La Jolla, California. He was found with approximately $15,000 in cash. He was carrying his brother's identification. He had camping and survival equipment in his vehicle. He had Laci's credit cards. His hair had been dyed, a noticeably different shade than it appeared in the photographs that had circulated nationally for months. His defense team would later argue the dye and the cash were unrelated to any attempt to flee. The jury didn't find that argument persuasive. The location carried its own weight. La Jolla sits near the Mexican border. Scott Peterson, the man who had spent 4 months performing the role of a grief-stricken husband, desperately seeking answers, was found in possession of cash, a false identity, and supplies consistent with someone who had no intention of staying. He was taken into custody without incident. He was charged with first-degree murder for Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for Connor Peterson. The distinction between those charges wasn't procedural. It reflected what the law recognized about the specific nature of what had been done. This wasn't a crime against one person. It was the elimination of an entire family. The unborn child was recognized separately because his death required separate intent, separate action, separate consideration. Connor wasn't collateral damage. He was part of the plan. The trial began in June 2004. It lasted 6 months. Venue was changed from Stanislaus County to San Mateo County because PRE trial publicity had made selecting an impartial jury in Modesto effectively impossible. There was no identified crime scene. There was no murder weapon recovered. What prosecutors built instead was something far more difficult and far more complete. A documented architecture of behavior, timeline, motive, and physical evidence that, taken together, pointed to one and only one conclusion. The affair and its specific construction were central, not just that Scott had been unfaithful, but that he had presented himself to Amber Frey as a widower while Laci was alive. That detail alone spoke to premeditation in ways that standard infidelity never could. The Amber Frey recordings were played for the jury in full. Financial records establishing the strain Scott was carrying without Laci's knowledge were presented with specificity. The boat, purchased weeks before the disappearance and never used again after Christmas Eve, was examined in detail. Expert testimony on the location where the bodies were found and its direct relationship to Scott's stated position on the bay that morning was delivered with precision. Currents, tides, decomposition timelines, all of it mapped back to the same point of origin, the place Scott said he was. Scott Peterson did not testify in his own defense. He sat through 6 months of proceedings with what court observers consistently described not as the devastation of an innocent man watching a false case being constructed, but as the managed composure of someone maintaining a carefully controlled internal position. He watched. He remained composed. He did not take the stand. On November 12, 2004, the jury convicted Scott Peterson of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for Connor. On March 16, 2005, he was sentenced to death. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where he would spend 15 years on death row filing appeal after appeal, each one asserting the same position the jury had already rejected. His conviction was not based on a single piece of evidence. It was based on the totality, and the totality was overwhelming. In August 2020, the California Supreme Court vacated Scott Peterson's death sentence. The ruling was based on a finding that jurors had been improperly dismissed during selection. Specifically, potential jurors who had expressed philosophical reservations about the death penalty had been excluded in ways the court found didn't meet required legal standards. But the conviction itself was not disturbed. The court drew a precise and deliberate line between the process that produced the sentence and the evidence that produced the verdict. The guilt finding remained entirely intact. In December 2021, Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California, where he remains today. The legal system had made its position clear. The process had flaws. The guilt was established and affirmed. Those were two separate conclusions, and the court held them separately with absolute precision. His legal team continued pursuing avenues of appeal. In 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project took up his case, petitioning for DNA testing on evidence from the original investigation. A judge granted access to one specific item, a piece of duct tape found on Laci's body. The results of that testing remain pending as of this recording. Then, in August 2024, Scott Peterson finally spoke. 21 years after his arrest, 15 years on death row, 3 years into a life sentence, he sat for his first on-camera interview since 2003. The Peacock documentary series Face to Face with Scott Peterson aired in 3 parts. Director Shireen Anderson conducted multiple video interviews with him from Mule Creek State Prison, 15 minutes at a time across several sessions. The world leaned in, with the specific anticipation of people who'd been waiting over 2 decades for a door to open. Here's what he said. He said he didn't kill his family. He said the investigation was flawed, and that investigators focused on him before evidence had the opportunity to point anywhere else. He acknowledged the affair and said he was ashamed. He pointed to a burglary that occurred across the street from the Peterson home on the 24th of December as a lead he believes investigators failed to pursue. He said, in words he appeared to have prepared carefully, "Don't trust me. Look at the evidence." But he didn't explain why Laci's remains and Connor's remains were recovered in San Francisco Bay within miles of the location where he told police he'd been fishing the morning she disappeared. He didn't name anyone he believes is responsible for her death. He didn't provide a coherent, specific, evidence-grounded account of what he believes actually happened on December 24th, 2002. Not in any of the 15-minute sessions that together constituted his most expansive public platform in over 2 decades. 21 years. A camera, a director, a national streaming platform, 3 episodes of dedicated airtime. The most high-profile true crime documentary opportunity available in 2024. After all that waiting, after all that preparation, after 21 years in which a genuinely innocent man would have assembled every overlooked witness, every documented fact, every piece of evidence pointing somewhere other than at him, the best Scott Peterson could offer was, "Don't trust me. Look at the evidence." The evidence convicted him. People who are genuinely innocent, when given a camera and 21 years of preparation, don't deliver managed performances. They deliver counter-narratives with the kind of specific, verifiable detail that only truth produces. They name names. They account for physical evidence completely. They hand you the thing no attorney, no appeal, no procedural argument has ever been able to produce on their behalf. Scott Peterson did what he's always done. He challenged process. He managed presentation. He performed the role of a man wronged by a broken system, precisely and consistently, across 23 years. He has never produced an account that explains all the evidence simultaneously in a way that doesn't require that evidence to mean something fundamentally different from what it actually says. The silence beneath the words isn't a gap in the record. The silence is the record. Now here's the part most true crime content never reaches, because documenting the affair and the finances and the boat and the body location, that's journalism. Important journalism. But it doesn't answer the question, sitting at the center of this case, refusing to leave. How does a man arrive at a decision like this? Not as an impulse, not in a moment of uncontrolled rage that overtook his judgment in an instant, but as a plan. A considered, premeditated plan that assembled itself across weeks and months, while he continued sharing a home with the woman he'd already decided wouldn't survive. Forensic behavioral analysts who study intimate partner homicide, specifically cases involving planned killing of a spouse, have identified a consistent psychological architecture in perpetrators of these crimes. It doesn't belong exclusively to Scott Peterson, but it maps onto his documented behavior with precision worth examining carefully. The first element is what researchers describe as accumulated identity collapse. Scott Peterson had constructed an entire life around a performed self, the charming man, the capable provider, the person everyone liked and no one could quite reach. By late 2002, that constructed self was failing on multiple fronts simultaneously. The finances were under strain. The marriage had become a performance he could no longer fully maintain. He was managing a secret relationship beginning to require answers he didn't have. And the arrival of a child in 6 weeks was going to make every one of those pressures permanent, public, and legally binding. For a man whose sense of self exists only in the reflection other people provide, whose internal experience of being a person depends entirely on the image he sustains in the world around him, this convergence isn't merely stressful. It's the active dismantling of the only self he's ever known how to be. When that self begins disintegrating in a person with this specific psychological profile, the response isn't to rebuild, it's to escape. The second element is what behavioral literature identifies as fantasy replacement. By November 2002, Scott Peterson wasn't living in reality in any functional psychological sense. He was living inside a constructed alternative, a world where he was already a widower, already grieving a loss that hadn't occurred, already free to begin again. He hadn't merely imagined this world, he'd populated it. He'd introduced himself into it with a false identity and invited another person to inhabit it alongside him. The fantasy had achieved a solidity in his mind that his actual life could no longer match. His actual life, Laci, the pregnancy, the house, the obligations, the community, the family, had become, in the internal architecture of his thinking, the obstacle standing between where he was and where he'd already decided he was going. The third element is the hardest to state, and the one evidence most clearly supports. Researchers who study this category of offender describe a process they term dehumanization by proximity. This doesn't mean Scott Peterson hated Laci. Documented evidence doesn't support that conclusion. It describes something more disturbing, and in some ways harder to comprehend. Gradual process by which the victim ceases to exist in the perpetrator's internal world as a person, and becomes instead a problem, not through hatred, through the slow and incremental withdrawal of empathy that occurs in someone who has decided, at some level that may not be fully conscious, what they're going to do. Laci stopped being a woman with 27 years of her own life, her own family, her own love, her own future. She became the thing standing between him and the existence he'd chosen. That quiet, bloodless, gradual reduction of a living person to an obstacle is the most disturbing truth this case contains. Not that Scott Peterson was a monster in any theatrical sense, but that he was a specific, and in some ways, ordinary kind of dangerous. A man who made, across months and years, a series of choices a psychologically grounded person wouldn't have made, and who, when those choices converged into a corner he couldn't perform his way out of, found the exit that was the final expression of everything he'd always been. Not a break from his character, the completion of it. Here's what research on this category of offender consistently documents, and what makes understanding this profile genuinely important beyond the Peterson case specifically. These men don't wake up on a single morning and make a single decision. The decision, in any meaningful psychological sense, is made incrementally across dozens and then hundreds of smaller moments in which the choice is made again and again, to avoid rather than confront, to perform rather than be honest, to construct rather than reveal. Each of those individual choices is, in isolation, unremarkable. Marriages carry distance. People move through difficult financial periods without disclosing the full weight. Affairs happen. None of those elements alone signals that a person is capable of what Scott Peterson chose. What creates the trajectory is the combination, and specifically the way each element reinforces and accelerates the next. The financial stress intensifies the need for the image. The need for the image makes honest conversation about finances psychologically impossible. The impossibility of that conversation deepens emotional distance from Laci. The distance from Laci makes the constructed world of Amber more vivid and more necessary. The vividness of that alternative makes the reality of Laci and the pregnancy feel progressively less like a life and progressively more like an obstacle. And the man at the center of that spiral, the man who's never developed the capacity to face himself honestly, to tolerate the discomfort of being genuinely known, to choose reality over performance, has no tools available for stopping it. He doesn't find his way out. He doesn't reach for help. He doesn't sit across from his wife and say, "I'm failing. I'm drowning. I don't know who I am outside the version of myself you believe in. I need something to be different." He never says that. Not to Laci, not to his parents, not to anyone, because saying that would require him to be a real person and performing was the only mode of existence he'd ever learned. But this case, at its center, isn't about Scott Peterson. It's about Laci. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She'd grown up in Modesto, California, in a family that loved her, with the visible, unguarded warmth you can see in every photograph of her mother Sharon from those years. She had a stepfather, Ron Gransky, who by every account treated her as entirely his own. She studied horticulture at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. She loved to cook with the specific enthusiasm of someone who understood that feeding people is a form of care. She kept a garden with genuine attention. She had a dog named MC Kenzie. She walked through the neighborhood on mornings when the Central Valley air was cold and clear. She had a sense of humor people who knew her described as quick and dry, the kind that catches you off guard and stays with you. She was 8 months pregnant on Christmas Eve 2002 with the specific joy of a woman who'd imagined this for a long time. She called her mother on the morning of the 24th of December. She sounded like herself. She sounded fine. She had no idea. The people who loved Laci, her mother Sharon, her brother Brent, her friends, the community built around her life in Modesto, have spent 23 years holding two things simultaneously: the grief of losing her and the particular compounding grief of knowing that the person who took her was the person she'd trusted most completely, the person whose name she shared, the person she'd built a home with, planned a future with, chosen a name for a child with. Sharon Rocha delivered a victim impact statement at Scott Peterson's sentencing hearing that people present in that courtroom have described as among the most devastating things they've ever witnessed in a legal setting. She spoke about Christmas Eve, about the call, about the weeks of searching, about April and what the ocean returned. She said, in words that stayed with everyone who heard them, that there was no fresh start, no solution, no escape. He didn't get away with anything. She was right. Scott Peterson is 51 years old. He's held at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. He will never sit across a table from anyone and perform the version of himself he spent his entire adult life constructing. He will never have a single day of the life he believed he was purchasing on the morning of December 2002. Connor Peterson never got to be born into the world. Laci Peterson was 27 years old with a garden and a dog and a child on the way, and a mother who adored her, and a future she had every reason to expect. She deserved every year she didn't get. You're watching a video about a case that was tried, convicted, and sentenced before some people in this audience were old enough to form clear memories. And the reason you're here isn't morbid curiosity. People who engage seriously with cases like this one aren't here for the horror. They're here because cases like the Peterson case leave behind a question no verdict ever fully closes. How do you not see it coming? How does a community not see it? How does a family not see it? How does a woman share a bed, a home, a pregnancy, and a life with a man who's already decided she's not going to survive and not know? The answer is what makes this case matter long past the courtroom. You don't see it because Scott Peterson was specifically and systematically constructed not to be seen. A man whose entire identity is externally projected, whose entire self is the image presented outward, doesn't produce the tells human instinct was built to detect. There's no escalating anger. There's no visible cruelty. There's no pattern of threats or physical danger, or the category of behavior every warning sign framework was designed to identify. There's only pleasantness, only ease, only the smooth, consistent surface of a man performing a role so completely that even the people closest to him couldn't find the seam. Laci Peterson wasn't naive. She wasn't passive. She'd begun, in the weeks before Christmas, to sense something was wrong, that Scott was different, distant, in a way she couldn't name or locate. She was reaching toward a husband who had already, in his own internal world, moved somewhere she couldn't follow. She noticed. She tried. She was deceived by a man who'd been practicing deception in the most fundamental possible way his entire life. Not just lying about where he was or who he was with, lying about who he was. And this is the part of the conversation about cases like this one that almost never happens. We invest significant time analyzing the perpetrator, his psychology, his choices, his profile. That analysis is important. And it's what this video has worked to do carefully and honestly across every section. But the harder and more necessary conversation is about what it means that the people closest to Scott Peterson, people who loved him, who shared years and holidays and daily life with him, had no framework available for seeing what he actually was, because the framework for seeing a person like Scott Peterson isn't instinct. It's not a feeling in your gut. It's not something that announces itself through obvious signals. It's the slow, patient, disciplined work of asking whether the person in front of you is real, whether what they show you corresponds to what's actually present, whether the ease they project is genuine ease, or the practiced ease of someone who spent a lifetime learning to produce a specific effect in the people around them. That kind of discernment isn't natural. It's not something most people are taught. And the people who pay the price for that gap aren't the Scott Petersons of the world. They're the Lacis, the people who exist inside a performance without knowing it, who reach toward someone who isn't there, who sense something is wrong, but can't name it, because naming it would require a vocabulary they were never given. Laci Peterson deserved better. Connor deserved to be born. Sharon Rocha deserved to grow old watching her grandchild grow up. They're owed our full attention and our complete and honest understanding. Not the version of this story recycled every anniversary with no new insight. The real one. The one that's harder to sit with. The one that doesn't resolve cleanly or allow you to walk away feeling everything's been explained and contained. Scott Peterson finally spoke about the reasons he killed his family. Not in a confession, not in a single moment of honesty that would have closed this case in human terms, even if it changed nothing legally. He spoke across 23 years of interviews and appeals and managed statements and prison communications. He spoke in the things he said, and he spoke even more clearly in the specific, deliberate way he never once answered the only question that's ever actually mattered. He spoke loudest in the silence, where the truth should have been. A man who couldn't afford to be exposed financially, personally, publicly. A man who'd already constructed his replacement life before the one he had was finished. A man for whom a pregnant wife and an unborn child had become, in the calculus of his own psychological survival, a problem rather than a family. And a man who chose, on the morning of December 24th, 2002, to solve that problem the only way his psychology had ever allowed him to solve anything. Not by facing it, by making it disappear. Scott Peterson, the man who wanted a fresh start more than he wanted his own family to live, is 51 years old in a cell in Ione, California, with no fresh start coming. Not today, not ever. If this is the kind of analysis you need, the kind that doesn't stop at the headlines, but follows the evidence all the way to the answer nobody else wants to say out loud, then you need to be subscribed to True Crime VIC. Hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to understand how cases like this actually work beneath the surface. And stay close, because there are more stories coming that deserve this level of truth. Thanks for watching.